The air at forward operating base Epsilon 7 tasted of diesel, frozen metal, and a profound, gnawing isolation. It was a taste Anya Petrova recognized, a flavor she had known in a dozen other forgotten corners of the world. Her transfer had been processed with the indifferent efficiency of a system that no longer knew what to do with her. She was a name, a number, and a file thick with redactions, assigned to the last place anyone of consequence wanted to be: inventory management. The supply depot was a cavernous, poorly lit warehouse where the cold seemed to coalesce and seep into bone. This was where they sent soldiers to finish their careers in quiet obsolescence. Her arrival was a non-event. The transport shuttle landed. She disembarked with a single duffel bag, and a bored-looking corporal named Diaz pointed her toward the depot without making eye contact. Inside, she found her workspace: a metal desk, a flickering terminal, and stacks of crates containing everything from MREs to sensitive guidance system components. Her predecessor had left the place in a state of ordered chaos, a system only he could have understood. Anya began her work without a word, her movements economical and precise. She didn't unpack her personal items. Save for a worn olive-drab jacket she hung on the back of her chair. Pinned to its breast was a name tag, not the standard issue black plastic one, but an old, faded strip of fabric. The letters, once stark white, were now a ghostly gray against the worn material. They spelled out a single word: Vellis. Private Elias Vance was the first to notice she was different. He was on depot duty, a punishment for a minor infraction, and he watched her for hours. She moved with a quiet, fluid grace that seemed out of place amidst the clanging metal and dust. While others would heave and grunt with the heavy crates, she found the perfect leverage points, her posture never breaking. She cataloged the entire west wall of munitions, a 2-day job for a team of 3, before the evening meal. She didn't speak. She didn't take breaks. She just worked. Vance saw the old name tag and assumed it was a memento, something from a parent or a past life. It seemed strangely personal for someone so detached. The mockery started in the mess hall on her 3rd day. Corporal Diaz, a man whose confidence far outstripped his competence, sauntered over to the table where Vance was sitting with Specialist Chun. "See the new museum piece in supply?" Diaz asked, jerking his chin toward Anya, who was eating alone in a corner, her focus entirely on her meal. Walks around with some goofy old patch on her jacket. "Vellis, what's that? Some kind of sci-fi convention call sign." Chun snickered. "Probably her gamer tag. My uncle had one of those from his LARPing days." Vance felt a prickle of annoyance. "She gets the work done," he muttered, defending her without knowing why. "Yeah, the work of a glorified stalker," Diaz scoffed, tearing into a piece of bread. "Place is a dead end. People don't get sent here for being superstars. They send you here to fade away." The conversation drifted, but the nickname stuck. In the hushed conversations of bored soldiers, Anya Petrova became Vellis the Gamer, the quiet ghost of the supply depot. They saw the faded tag not as a history, but as a pathetic attempt to cling to something that never was. They mocked her because her quiet presence was a mirror to their own insignificance on this frozen rock, and it was easier to laugh at her than to confront their own reality. Anya heard the whispers. She saw the smirks, and like the biting wind outside the compound walls, she simply endured them, her face a mask of placid indifference. Her focus was on the inventory, on the numbers, and on the subtle, dangerous vibrations she could feel in the bedrock of the base itself. The dismissal she received from the enlisted personnel was a passive, insidious thing, born of boredom and ignorance. The dismissal from Colonel Marcus Thorne was brutally direct. He summoned her to his office on her 5th day. The room was aggressively neat, every pen aligned, every file perfectly squared. It was the office of a man who believed control over his immediate environment translated to control over the chaotic reality of his profession. He did not ask her to sit. He remained standing behind his large desk, a physical barrier between his authority and her perceived irrelevance. He held a thin file in his hand, her file, and tapped it against his palm with rhythmic impatience. "Petrova," he began, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, I've reviewed your transfer orders. Frankly, I'm confused. Command saw fit to send me another body for supply, a position that was hardly a priority, while I am critically understaffed in signals intelligence and perimeter security. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the sterile air. Your record is sparse. Commendations for logistical efficiency dating back years. Then a long period of unspecified duties. It ends with a recommendation for a low-stress, non-combat role. So, here you are. Anya stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over his shoulder, a framed map of the surrounding mountain range. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't defend herself. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. Let me be clear, Thorne continued, leaning forward slightly, his knuckles white on the desk. This is an active forward operating base, not a retirement home. We are the tip of the spear in this sector. Every person here has a vital role. I expect them to perform it without distraction. Your role is to count boxes. You will count them, you will keep your records immaculate, and you will stay out of the way of the real soldiers who are keeping this base secure. He finally looked down at her uniform, his eyes catching the faded name tag on her jacket, which she wore even indoors. A faint, condescending smile touched his lips. And lose that. It's out of regulation. Whatever sentimental value it holds, this is a professional military installation, not a social club. He expected a response. A flicker of defiance, a stammered apology, something. He got nothing. Anya's expression did not change. Her calm was a placid lake he could not disturb. She gave a single, curt nod. Understood, Colonel. Her voice was low and steady, carrying no trace of emotion. It was the voice of someone for whom this conversation was merely a procedural annoyance, a box to be checked. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already turning his attention to a datapad on his desk. He had categorized her, filed her away in his mind as surplus personnel, a piece of administrative driftwood that had washed up on his shore. He was a man who saw the world through the lens of regulations and operational directives. A soldier was defined by their current rank, their assigned role, and their documented skills. Her file said she was a logistics specialist past her prime. Therefore, that is all she could ever be. As Anya walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, she felt no anger. She felt a cold, familiar certainty. Colonel Thorne was a predictable system, just like the flawed inventory software she was currently fixing. And like any system, he had critical vulnerabilities. He saw a faded name tag as a breach of decorum. He had no idea it was a warning label. Back in the depot, she didn't remove the tag. She simply zipped her jacket up a little higher, the worn fabric a silent act of defiance he was too blind to ever notice. Anya's world contracted to the cavernous space of the supply depot, but her mind expanded to encompass the entire base. While her hands were busy scanning barcodes and updating manifests, her senses were absorbing everything. She was a human diagnostic tool, constantly running in the background, identifying flaws and potential points of failure. She didn't just see stacks of crates. She saw patterns. She noticed that the replacement parts for the primary communications array's frequency modulator were stored in the unheated section of the warehouse, a violation of their temperature-sensitive handling protocols. The components would be 50% less effective if they were ever needed in an emergency. She made a silent note, moving the crates herself to the climate-controlled sector without filing a report or seeking permission. It was simply a problem to be solved. Her observation extended to the human element. She watched the perimeter guards during their shift changes. She saw the slight hesitation, the fraction of a second where coverage was thinned as one team swapped out for another. It was a tiny window, less than 90 seconds, but it was a predictable vulnerability. An enemy who studied their patterns could exploit it. She mapped the patrol routes in her head, noting the blind spots created by the new snow drifts from the previous night's fall. She listened to the hum of the base's main power generator, a sound everyone else ignored. She could hear a subtle irregularity in its cycle, a faint ticking sound that suggested a bearing was beginning to wear. It would last for months, perhaps, but it was a weakness, a single point of failure for the entire facility's life support and defense systems. In the mess hall, she sat alone, but she was never truly separate. She was a node, receiving data. She listened to the soldiers' chatter. They complained about the cold, the food, the monotonous patrols. They spoke of home. Their talk was a barometer of the base's morale. Stable but brittle. They were bored and complacent, a dangerous combination in a hostile environment. It was during one of these meals that she heard her name tag being discussed again. Corporal Diaz was holding court, telling an exaggerated story about a training exercise. So the sergeant screams, "What's your designation, soldier?" And this new kid, shaking in his boots, he forgets his squad name and just blurts out his online handle, Warlock 69. The table erupted in laughter. Diaz grinned and pointed his fork toward Anya's corner. "See? Just like our depot ghost. I bet Vellis was her character name in some ancient fantasy game. Probably a level 80 paladin of the supply closet." More laughter followed. Vance, sitting nearby, shifted uncomfortably. He had watched her for over a week now. He saw the way she anticipated the need for a specific tool before the mechanics even asked for it. He saw how she had reorganized the entire medical supply section, arranging trauma kits for immediate grab-and-go access, a system far more logical than the one in the field manual. There was an intelligence and foresight to her quiet work that unsettled him. The name on the tag felt less like a joke and more like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Anya heard every word. Her expression remained neutral, her focus on the stew in her bowl. Their mockery was just noise, irrelevant data. It did not alter the facts she had gathered. Fact: the base's communication protocols relied too heavily on a single satellite uplink, with insufficient redundancy. Fact: the emergency medical evacuation plans did not account for the region's notoriously sudden and violent changes in weather. Fact: Colonel Thorne's rigid adherence to standard operating procedure made his command predictable, and therefore vulnerable to an unconventional enemy. She cataloged these observations alongside the number of spare plasma conduits and thermal blankets. To her, they were all just inventory. They were all just pieces on a board, and she was beginning to see a game no one else even knew was being played. Her faded name tag was a relic of a time when her job wasn't to count the pieces, but to sweep them from the board entirely. The pressure began as a whisper of wind, a subtle change in the tone of the ever-present gale that scoured the mountainside. Within an hour, it was a screaming banshee. A freak blizzard descended upon Epsilon 7 with a ferocity that defied meteorological predictions. The world beyond the compound's perimeter fences dissolved into a roiling chaos of white. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled with enough force to make the very buildings groan in protest. It was more than a storm. It was a siege laid by nature itself. Colonel Thorne convened an emergency briefing in the command center. The atmosphere was tense. Screens that normally displayed clear satellite imagery of the surrounding territory were now filled with static or useless swirls of white. "What's our status?" Thorne demanded, his voice tight. A young lieutenant from the Signals Corps, his face pale, answered, "Sir, the storm is wreaking havoc on our satellite uplink. We're experiencing severe signal degradation. We've lost contact with command. All long-range comms are down." Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of the room's disciplined calm. Being cut off was a soldier's primal fear. It meant no support, no intelligence, no evacuation. They were alone. "Get them back up," Thorne ordered, his voice a low growl. "Work the problem, Lieutenant." "We're trying, sir," the officer stammered. "The dish is iced over, and the wind is beyond safety limits for a maintenance crew. We're attempting to boost the signal from here, but the system is unstable." As he spoke, a new alert flashed on a secondary screen. It was a data packet from a remote sensor drone that had managed to transmit one final burst before going dark. The data was heavily corrupted, a mess of fragmented code and garbled readings. "What is that?" Thorne snapped. A data analyst, a woman named Specialist Ionescu, frantically typed at her console. "Sir, it's from Drone 7, on the Eastern Pass." "Can't be sure." The data is 90% corrupt. But the fragments, they suggest movement. Multiple heat signatures, non-allied IFF tags. The pattern is inconsistent with local wildlife. The room fell silent. The only sound the howling of the wind outside and the frantic clicking of keys. An enemy force moving under the cover of the storm of the century. It was a textbook unconventional warfare tactic. They were blind, deaf, and a hostile presence was closing in. The calm of routine operations shattered. Officers began shouting suggestions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear-driven urgency. It could be a glitch, a phantom reading caused by the storm. We should deploy a scout team, standard reconnaissance pattern. A scout team in this? That's a suicide mission. They won't see 5 feet in front of them. Colonel Thorne stood in the center of the growing chaos, his face a mask of grim determination. His mind raced, cycling through protocols and procedures, but the manuals had no chapter for this specific combination of disasters. He was trying to fit an unprecedented problem into a pre-approved box, and it wasn't working. The pressure mounted with every passing second. The rhythmic ticking Anya had noticed in the main generator seemed to echo in the command center. A steady, ominous beat counting down to a catastrophe he could no longer control. While the command staff panicked, Anya was in the depot, conducting a final check on the emergency cold weather gear. She could feel the vibrations of the base's anxiety through the concrete floor, a familiar tremor that always preceded a crisis. She calmly noted that the inventory of thermal batteries was 20% lower than the official log stated. Another failure of the system. She corrected the log, her movements unhurried. The storm raged outside, and a different kind of storm was building within the command center. But in her small corner of the world, there was only the quiet certainty of the task at hand. The pressure was building, and soon something would have to break. The breaking point came with a sharp crackle and a plume of acrid smoke from a console in the command center. "Main comms are gone," the signals lieutenant shouted, his voice cracking with alarm. "Total system failure. It's not just the uplink. The entire internal hub is down." The last vestiges of order in the room evaporated. Colonel Thorne slammed his fist on the central console. "Get it back. Now!" The tech specialists swarmed the smoking panel, pulling out diagnostic tools and shouting jargon at one another. But their efforts were frantic and disorganized. They were trained to follow flowcharts, to replace modules the system told them were failing. But the system itself was dead. They were lost. Anya had felt the power fluctuation in the depot. The lights had flickered for a fraction of a second, and the hum of her inventory terminal had changed its pitch before dying. She knew what it meant. She left her station, her steps measured and deliberate, and walked towards the command center. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She moved with the quiet purpose of a surgeon approaching an operating table. When she reached the open doorway, she was met with a scene of controlled chaos. No one noticed her at first. She stood there for a full 10 seconds, observing. She saw the panicked faces, the uselessly flashing red lights, the smoke coiling towards the ceiling. She analyzed the scene, her mind processing the data with chilling efficiency. Then she moved. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't announce her presence. She walked past the stunned officers, directly to the failed communications console. A young specialist, seeing her approach, moved to block her way. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. We have it under..." Anya didn't even look at him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, not forcefully, but with an undeniable weight that made him step aside without a conscious thought. She knelt before the open panel. The other technicians stopped what they were doing, startled by her silent intrusion. "Who the hell is this?" one of them muttered. "It's the supply clerk," another whispered back in disbelief. Anya ignored them all. Her eyes scanned the complex web of wires and circuit boards. She didn't reach for a diagnostic tablet or a multimeter. Her tools were her senses. She leaned in, her nose close to the fried components, sniffing the air. She wasn't just smelling smoke. She was identifying the specific scent of a burned-out T3 relay capacitor, a smell distinct from that of a standard processor failure. Her fingers, deft and sure, gently touched a bundle of fiber optic cables near the base of the unit, feeling for the subtle vibration of the backup power line. She found it, a faint thrumming that told her the core power was still active. The fault was in the distribution hub. Colonel Thorne finally noticed her. "Petrova, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get away from that console." His voice was a thunderclap in the tense room. Anya did not flinch. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his for the first time. "Your diagnostic is wrong," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise. "You're looking for a software corruption. It's a hardware failure." The initial power surge from the generator fluctuation blew the primary relay. The secondary relay iced over. The system tried to compensate, overloaded the internal router, and fried the board. She spoke in simple, declarative sentences. It wasn't a theory. It was an autopsy report. Before anyone could respond, she reached into a pouch on her belt and pulled out a small, multi-purpose tool. With practiced ease, she unclipped the burned-out relay. Then she looked at the mess of wires. Without a replacement part, they were still dead in the water. Anya's eyes scanned the room, landing on a discarded, obsolete data terminal sitting in a corner. In seconds, she was at the terminal, prying open its casing. She located its internal power conduit, stripped a short length of copper wire from it, and returned to the main console. Her hands moved with a blur of efficiency. She bypassed the entire relay switch, using the scavenged wire to create a direct, crude bridge between the backup power line and the primary distribution node. It was an ugly, dangerous fix, a field expedient that wasn't in any manual. She insulated the connection with a strip of electrical tape from her own tool pouch. "Try it now," she said, her voice still level. The lead signals officer, looking at Thorne for confirmation and receiving a stunned, hesitant nod, typed a reboot command into a secondary terminal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a flicker, the screens on the main console blinked to life one by one. They were awash with error messages and diagnostic warnings, but they were on. A weak but stable internal network connection had been established. The command center was silent, save for the hum of resurrected electronics and the howling of the wind. Everyone stared, not at the screens, but at the quiet woman from the supply depot who now stood and calmly wiped her hands on her trousers. She hadn't bragged. She hadn't even smiled. She had simply solved an unsolvable problem and was now preparing to walk away. The atmosphere in the command center underwent a profound and immediate transformation. The frantic, headless panic was replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. The mocking whispers about Vellis the gamer died in the throats of every soldier who had witnessed what just happened. Corporal Diaz, who had been standing near the doorway, stared with his mouth agape, his earlier jokes turning to ash in his memory. Private Vance watched her with a look of sheer awe. He hadn't just seen a competent soldier. He had seen a level of expertise so profound it operated on a plane entirely separate from their own. She hadn't followed a procedure. She had intuited the problem, diagnosed it with senses alone, and improvised a solution from scrap. It was less like repair and more like magic. Colonel Thorne was the most affected. He stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the obsolete logistics clerk he had condescendingly dismissed with the hypercompetent operative who had just resurrected his command center. He felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. He had not only underestimated her, he had been fundamentally, professionally wrong about her. His entire system of judgment, based on files and formal roles, had been proven worthless. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Petrova," he said, his tone stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Report. How did you know that would work?" Anya turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "The smell of a T3 capacitor burn is unique. The generator's frequency dip suggested a power surge, not a software bug. The icing on the secondary relay was a logical assumption based on its location near the external conduit and the current ambient temperature," she explained simply. It was the most probable sequence of failures. Her explanation was as concise and efficient as her actions. She presented it as a simple deduction, but to everyone in the room, It was clear this was no lucky guess. It was the result of a vast and deep well of experience. The partial restoration of the network allowed Specialist Ionescu to recover a bit more of the corrupted data from the drone. "Sir, I've got a little more," she announced. Her voice filled with a new respect as she addressed the room that now included Anya. "The heat signatures are definitely humanoid, and they're using military-grade thermal cloaking, which is why the readings are so faint. There are at least a dozen of them, maybe more." The reality of the tactical situation crashed back in. They were still blind, still cut off from the outside world, and now they had confirmation of an enemy force using sophisticated technology, moving with purpose through the storm. Thorne looked at the tactical map, then at his officers, and finally, his gaze settled on Anya. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer a ghost in the supply depot. She was a resource, an unknown quantity whose value he was only just beginning to comprehend. The curiosity in the room was palpable. The soldiers, the technicians, the officers, they all looked at her differently now. The faded name tag on her jacket no longer seemed pathetic or strange. It now looked like a locked door, and they were all suddenly desperate to know what was behind it. Thorne, a man who hated uncertainty above all else, knew he had to test her again. The fate of his base might depend on it. "Stay here, Petrova," he commanded, his voice tight. "I'm not done with you." He had moved from dismissal to suspicion, and was now rapidly approaching a state of reluctant dependence. The tactical situation was grim. With long-range communications still down, Colonel Thorne was forced to operate on the fragmented, unreliable data they had. The faint heat signatures suggested a vector of approach towards the northeastern supply route, a narrow canyon pass that was a known vulnerability. It was the most logical point for an ambush. "They're trying to cut us off, to isolate us and lay siege," Thorne declared, his finger tracing the route on the digital map. "They'll set up kill zones in the canyon, wait for us to send a patrol or a supply convoy, and hit us hard," his officers murmured in agreement. It was a standard, by-the-book analysis. "We need eyes out there," Thorne continued, his voice regaining some of its command authority. "We can't just sit here blind. I want a scout team ready to move out in 10 minutes. 2 vehicles, standard reconnaissance loadout. They'll proceed with extreme caution to Point Alpha, assess the situation, and report back." A young captain, O'Malley, spoke up, his face etched with concern. "Sir, in this blizzard? With respect, visibility is near zero. My men would be driving into a meat grinder if the enemy is already dug in. It's a risk we have to take, Captain," Thorne countered, his jaw tight. "A calculated risk. Doing nothing is not an option." It was then that Anya stepped forward. She had been standing silently at the edge of the command group, observing the map, listening to their analysis. Every eye in the room turned to her. Colonel Thorne's gaze narrowed. "You have something to add, Petrova?" His tone was a challenge, a demand for her to prove that what they'd seen before wasn't a fluke. "Your plan is flawed, Colonel," she stated, her voice devoid of insubordination but heavy with certainty. "You're making 2 incorrect assumptions." Thorne's face hardened. "Enlighten me." "First," Anya said, pointing to the map, "you assume their target is the supply route. That's what they want you to think. It's the obvious target, which is why it's a feint. Committing a scout team, there is not a calculated risk. It's a sacrifice. You'd be sending them exactly where the enemy expects you to." She then pointed to a different part of the map, a seemingly random patch of rugged, exposed terrain far to the south of the canyon. "Second, you assume they are a large force planning a siege. The data doesn't support that. The thermal cloaking, the movement under cover of this storm. This isn't a conventional assault team. It's a small, elite sapper unit. Their objective isn't to cut us off. It's to decapitate us." A tense silence filled the command center. Anya's analysis was so completely counter to Thorne's that it seemed, for a moment, absurd. "Decapitate us?" Thorne repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "What target would they be after?" Anya's gaze moved from the map to Thorne's eyes. "The one thing this base cannot function without. The one target whose destruction would leave you powerless, in the dark, and freezing in sub-zero temperatures. They're not going for the canyon. They're going for the main power generator. She indicated the spot on the map again. The generator is located here. The terrain is more difficult, but it provides better cover for a small team. And I caught something in the uncorrupted fragments of the drone's data stream. It wasn't just heat signatures. There was a faint EM signal, a low-frequency burst. It's the signature of the explosive charges used by their special forces. It's old tech, but reliable in extreme cold where more advanced electronics might fail. They're already there, Colonel. They're planting charges right now. The audacity of her claim was breathtaking. She had taken the same scraps of data that his entire intelligence team had analyzed and constructed a completely different, far more terrifying scenario. And she delivered it with the calm conviction of someone stating a known fact. Captain O'Malley looked from Anya to Thorne, his eyes wide. The other officers were muttering amongst themselves, their confidence in the colonel's plan utterly shaken. Thorne was cornered. To follow his own plan now felt like willful ignorance. To follow the advice of this unknown supply clerk was a monumental blow to his pride and authority. But the lives of his men and the security of his base hung in the balance. The second test was before him, and it was far more than just a question of tactics. It was a test of his ability to recognize competence, even when it came in a form he refused to acknowledge. He stared at Anya, his mind racing. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She wasn't asking him to believe her. She was telling him what was happening. His decision now would define his command. The air in the command center was thick enough to taste. Colonel Thorne stared at the tactical map, his own plan looking increasingly foolish and reckless in the face of Anya's chillingly logical assessment. Every instinct, honed by years of rigid adherence to doctrine, screamed at him to trust his own judgment, to trust the established hierarchy. But the cold, unwavering confidence in Petrova's eyes held a weight that protocol could not counterbalance. The memory of her bringing the comms back from the dead was too fresh, too undeniable. He was a man adrift, his tactical certainties torn away, and she was the only lighthouse in the storm. "O'Malley," Thorne finally ground out, his voice rough, "take your team, not to the canyon, to the generator. Full combat, low doubt. I want a silent, immediate sweep of that entire sector. If you see anything, you engage. Ionescu, get every sensor we have, no matter how weak, focused on that southern approach. I want to know if a mouse breathes out there." The captain, visibly relieved, nodded sharply. "Yes, sir." He and his team were out of the room in seconds, their movements purposeful and energized. The rest of the command staff watched, a mixture of apprehension and awe on their faces. The base's entire defense strategy had just been overturned by the woman who, that morning, had been tasked with counting blankets. As O'Malley's team moved out, a new sound pierced the howl of the blizzard. The strained, powerful engines of a heavy transport shuttle making a dangerous approach. "Sir," the air traffic controller called out, "we have an inbound aircraft, priority code Omega. It's General Sterling's transport." Thorne's blood ran cold. A surprise inspection from the theater commander, General Kalen Sterling, in the middle of a blizzard and a potential enemy attack. The situation had gone from a crisis to a nightmare. The shuttle landed with a heavy thud on the cleared landing pad, its engines screaming against the wind. Moments later, the main door of the command center burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and a tall, imposing figure. General Sterling was a man carved from granite, his face a roadmap of old campaigns, his presence radiating an aura of absolute authority that dwarfed Thorne's. "Colonel," Sterling's voice was a low rumble that cut through the room's tension. "Report. Command lost contact with you 3 hours ago." "What the hell is going on here?" Thorne snapped to attention, his mind racing to formulate a coherent summary of the chaotic events. "General, we were hit by an unforecasted cyclonic storm. Complete comms blackout. We have a potential hostile contact, special forces, moving on our position. We've just dispatched a team to intercept." As Thorne spoke, General Sterling's sharp eyes swept the room, taking in the stressed faces, the jury-rigged comms console, and the tactical map displaying the new defensive posture. His gaze was analytical, missing nothing. It passed over the various officers and technicians, and then it stopped. It stopped on Anya Petrova. She had stepped back from the main console, her part in the drama seemingly over, and was standing quietly near the wall, ready to return to the anonymity of her depot. She was just another soldier in the room, insignificant, except for the old, faded name tag on her jacket. For a long moment the general just stared. The blood drained from his face. His stern, commanding expression slackened into one of utter, profound shock. The other officers followed his gaze, confused by his sudden silence. They saw only the supply clerk. The general saw a ghost. He took a half-step forward, his eyes locked on the worn fabric patch. The name, barely legible, seemed to hang in the air between them. He ignored Colonel Thorne, who had stopped his report mid-sentence. He ignored everyone. His universe had suddenly contracted to include only himself and the quiet woman by the wall. He whispered the name, his voice hoarse with disbelief, a sound so quiet it was almost lost in the wind outside. But in the silent room, it was as loud as a cannon shot. Vellis! The moment the name left General Sterling's lips, the entire context of the room fractured and reassembled itself into something new and terrifyingly clear. Colonel Thorne and his staff stared, uncomprehending. To them, it was just the strange word from her tag. To the general, it was an incantation, a name that unlocked a history they couldn't even imagine. Sterling took another step, then another, his movements stiff as if in a dream. He walked directly past the bewildered Thorne and stopped a single foot in front of Anya. He looked from her stoic, impassive face down to the faded tag, and back up again. The recognition in his eyes was absolute now, mixed with a reverence that bordered on fear. He straightened his back, his posture becoming ramrod straight, far more rigid than any salute he had ever given a subordinate. He raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest, most precise salute Thorne had ever witnessed. It was not the salute of a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a legend. "Vellis?" Sterling said, his voice now clear and filled with a gravitas that commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. "I thought you were dead." Anya did not return the salute. She simply met his gaze and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Reports were exaggerated, General. Her voice was as calm as ever, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something ancient and weary in her eyes. Thorne finally found his voice, sputtering with confusion. "General, I don't understand. This is Specialist Petrova, from my supply depot." Sterling slowly lowered his hand, but his eyes never left Anya. He turned his head just enough to address the colonel, his voice dripping with an icy fury that made Thorne physically flinch. "Colonel, you are a fool. You have been in the presence of a ghost for 5 days and saw nothing but a clerk. This is not Specialist Petrova. This is Vellis, the sole survivor and operational lead of the Onyx Protocol." A wave of shock rippled through the room. The Onyx Protocol was a myth, a Black Ops fairy tale whispered in intelligence circles. It referred to a small, deniable asset team that took on the most impossible missions 20 years ago, operating so far outside the lines that their very existence was classified above top secret. They were assassins, saboteurs, and strategists of the highest order. Their operational success rate was 100%. Their casualty rate was also 100%. They were all listed as killed in action during the Scylla incursion. "That's impossible," Thorne stammered. "The Onyx files are sealed. All operatives were declared deceased." "They were to give them peace," Sterling said, his voice low. "Vellis was the one who completed the mission. Alone. She dismantled the entire insurrectionist network in 72 hours. The official story is that a drone strike did it. The truth is, she did it. We listed her as Kia to protect her, to let her disappear. We owed her that much." He turned back to Anya. "What are you doing here?" Before she could answer, Captain O'Malley's voice crackled over the newly restored comms. "Command, this is O'Malley. We have contact. Hostiles at the generator." Exactly as predicted. They were setting charges. "We're engaged." The sounds of suppressed gunfire echoed faintly over the speaker. The proof of her analysis was now being broadcast in real time. General Sterling looked at Thorne, his expression one of utter contempt. Then he looked back at Anya, his face softening with a profound, bone-deep respect. You saved this base. Vellis, the soldiers who had mocked her, who had called her a gamer and a ghost, could only stare, their faces pale with shame and awe. The name tag wasn't a memory of a game. It was a tombstone for a life she had been forced to live, and a monument to a level of skill they could never hope to achieve. The brief, violent firefight at the generator ended as quickly as it began. Captain O'Malley's team, forewarned and perfectly positioned thanks to Anya's intelligence, neutralized the enemy sappers with brutal efficiency. His final report confirmed it. A 5-man elite team, exactly as she had theorized, caught in the act of rigging the generator's primary coolant system with high explosives. The crisis was over. The base was secure. As O'Malley's report concluded, the blizzard, as if its purpose had been served, began to relent. The howling wind softened to a mournful sigh, and through the swirling snow, the first pale light of dawn began to break. Inside the command center, the silence was a heavy shroud. The weight of the revelation about Anya, about Vellis, had settled over everyone. Colonel Thorne stood stiffly, his face a mask of humiliation. He had not just been wrong. He had been dangerously, incompetently wrong. He had belittled and dismissed the single most valuable asset in his entire command. He cleared his throat, the sound small and pathetic in the cavernous room. He walked over to Anya, who stood with the same quiet poise she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. He stopped before her and executed a formal, if somewhat shaky, salute. "Specialist, ma'am," he began, stumbling over the rank. I offer my deepest apologies. My judgment was flawed. There is no excuse for my conduct. You saved us all." Anya looked at him, her eyes holding no malice, no triumph, only a deep, abiding weariness. She gave a slight nod, accepting the apology without comment. It was not what she required. His respect, like his earlier dismissal, was irrelevant to the facts of the situation. General Sterling stepped forward, placing a hand on Thorne's shoulder with just enough pressure to be a warning. "You're damn right it was flawed, Colonel. You'll be explaining your command decisions to me in private." He then turned his full attention to Anya, his expression softening. "It's good to see you, Vellis. Truly. The world is a lesser place without you in it. This quiet life, it doesn't suit you. I can make a call. I can have you reinstated. Name your assignment. Command of a ghost team. Strategic advisor at CENTCOM. Anything you want, it's yours." It was the offer of a lifetime. A return to the world she had dominated, a restoration of her status, an escape from the cold anonymity of the supply depot. The entire room held its breath, waiting for her answer. Anya considered the general's offer for a long moment. A faint, sad smile touched her lips, the first real expression anyone at Epsilon 7 had ever seen from her. "Thank you, General. But my war is over. I've had enough of the noise." She gestured vaguely at the racks of servers and tactical screens. "This is all just inventory now. I'm good at inventory. I think I'll stay." Her refusal was quiet, absolute, and spoken with the finality of a chapter long since closed. She wanted peace, not power. She turned and, without another word, walked out of the command center. The assembled soldiers and officers parted for her as if the sea was parting for Moses. They watched her go, this living myth, this ghost who had walked among them unnoticed, as she headed back to her cavernous, silent warehouse. The name Vellis echoed in the minds of everyone she passed, no longer a source of mockery, but a title of profound and lasting respect. The storm had broken, and in its wake, the truth had been laid bare. Dignity wasn't in a rank or a title. It was earned in silence and proven by action. Anya Petrova had proven hers beyond all doubt.